If you look around today in, say, medicine or finance, even biology, the reality is that we are absolutely drowning in data.
We are, and this flood of information has fueled entire new fields, things like data mining and machine learning, which are all designed to harness that chaos.
But just having the data, that's only the first step, right? The really fascinating part is how do you transform these massive, messy tables of numbers into something useful, into a predictive tool?
Exactly. Our mission in this deep dive is to get past the intimidating terminology and get right to the concepts behind how these modern prediction models actually work.
Okay.
We're focusing today on what's called supervised learning. It's this foundational idea of teaching a model or a learner by showing it labeled data where you already know the answers.
So you use those known patterns to predict outcomes for new things it's never seen before.
That's the core idea.
Okay, let's unpack this. The challenge of understanding this data has fundamentally driven the development of all these new tools in statistical learning. And to ground this, because it can get very abstract, let's start with a classic example from the source material: how to filter spam email.
Yes, this is a perfect illustration. In one of the foundational studies, researchers looked at, I think it was 4,601 email messages.
Right, a huge data set.
A huge data set. And for every single message, they knew definitively if it was spam or if it was legitimate.
So how do you turn an email into numbers?
Well, they analyzed the relative frequencies of 57 common words and even punctuation marks within each one.
So instead of the model reading the email, it's just counting keywords.
Yeah.
And the results are pretty stark, aren't they?
They really are. When you compare the average percentages between regular email and spam, certain features just scream, "I am spam."
Like what?
Oh, specific keywords like the word free or even just the exclamation point showed this enormous difference in average frequency.
And I saw George was in there too, which is interesting.
It is, right. It probably indicates the kind of personal correspondence that was typical for the users in that study, so it acted as a strong signal for legitimate email. But this whole setup using known counts to build a filter, that's supervised learning in its purest form.
It sounds so simple, but we know it's not. And that brings us to this core tension in modeling, what we could call the predictor's paradox. It's this choice between building a super detailed local model versus a more rigid, structured one that uses a simpler rule.
And when we try to build that local, detailed model, we almost always start with the most intuitive approach, something called k-nearest neighbor, or KNN.
Tell us how that works. It sounds like just plain common sense.
It basically is. It's common sense turned into math. If you want to predict the outcome for a new point, say a new email, you just look at the Naker training examples that are closest to it.
And you average them.
You average them if it's a number, or you take a majority vote if you're classifying. You just see what its neighbors did.
That feels almost foolproof. It seems like you're aiming directly for the best possible answer, what mathematicians call the conditional expectation, or EIX.
You've nailed it. That's the theoretical gold standard. It's the best possible prediction you could ever make if you had, a perfect infinite amount of data. And KNN in simple problems gets you really close to that.
But here's where it gets really interesting. This simple, beautiful idea just runs headfirst into a brutal statistical roadblock.
It does. That roadblock is famously known as the curse of dimensionality.
A term from Richard Bellman back in 1961.
That's the one. And the curse means that our very human, intuitive idea of closeness completely breaks down when you have a lot of input dimensions.
Explain that breakdown. How does geometry betray us here?
Well, think about low dimensions. Let's say just two, like height and weight. If I pick the 5 closest people to you in a room, they're genuinely close. The little region you're averaging over is truly local.
The assumption holds.
The assumption holds. But now imagine your data doesn't have 2 inputs, but 100. 100 dimensions. If you want to find those same 5 nearest points, the neighborhood you have to draw to capture them just 4, it explodes in size.
So the nearest neighbors aren't actually close anymore.
Not at all. They might match you on a few dimensions, but they could be wildly different on the other 95. They become metrically huge, and so their outcomes don't really tell you anything reliable about your own.
The whole assumption that you can average a local region just falls apart.
It fails miserably. The data becomes sparse. There are too many directions for points to be far away from each other.
And this isn't just a theoretical problem. You shared some striking evidence on this.
You can see it in the numbers. The expected prediction error of a one nearest neighbor model just grows and grows almost linearly with the number of dimensions.
While a simple linear model's error barely moves.
Barely moves, assuming the underlying relationship is somewhat simple. rigidity suddenly becomes a huge advantage.
So the instability of local methods like KNN in high dimensions, what statisticians call high variance, is what drives us back toward more structured, more restricted models.
Exactly. We can't trust local averaging, so we have to impose some heavy restrictions. And that brings us right back to linear models. Their simple structure is what shields them from the curse.
Right, linear models are the old workhorses. They're stable, they're interpretable. But they have their own weaknesses, don't they? What happens when two or three of your input variables are basically measuring the same thing?
That is the big vulnerability of standard linear regression. It's called multicollinearity. When your predictors are highly correlated, it completely destabilizes the individual coefficient estimates. The model can't figure out who gets the credit.
Let's make that concrete with the prostate cancer data example.
Okay. In that data, we're using clinical variables to predict cancer stage. One variable, alcohol, the log of cancer volume, is highly predictive. It has a high Z-score. It's very significant
On its own.
on its own. But then we introduce a second, highly correlated variable, LCP, another measure related to cancer volume.
And suddenly LCP becomes insignificant.
Its Z-score just plummets. It doesn't mean LCP isn't important. It just means that once its correlated twin is in the model, its unique contribution is too shaky to measure reliably. The coefficients for both of them inflate and sort of fight with each other.
Making it impossible to interpret what each one is actually doing. It's like having two chefs who both claim they made the dish great, but they use the same secret ingredient.
It's a perfect analogy. And that's why we turn to regularization, or what some people call shrinkage methods. The idea is to deliberately punish large coefficients to stop them from inflating like that.
And we hear about two main types all the time, ridge and lasso. What's the practical difference?
So ridge regression uses what's called in Tool-Taller-2 penalty. You can think of it as adding a penalty that's proportional to the sum of the squared coefficients. It provides this smooth, continuous shrinkage.
So it pulls everything a little closer to zero, but nothing ever quite gets there.
Precisely. It's great when you think all your features are probably relevant, even if they're correlated, but then you have lasso.
The least absolute shrinkage and selection operator.
And lasso uses an Oldall-1 penalty, so it penalizes the sum of the absolute values of the coefficients.
And that small change from squared values to absolute values is everything.
It's the whole breakthrough. Because of the geometry of that constraint, the optimization process doesn't just shrink the coefficients, it does something unique. It can force some of them to be exactly zero.
Wait, exactly zero. Why is that such a game changer?
Because it performs automatic feature selection. If you start with 1,000 potential predictors and you suspect maybe only 10 of them are actually important, Lasso can find those 10 and discard the rest by setting their coefficients to zero.
So it cleans up the model for you.
It encourages a sparse solution. It makes the model way more interpretable. Ridge is fantastic for stabilization, but Lasso is just superior if you need to discover the few important signals hidden in a lot of noise.
Which brings us full circle to this bigger, more philosophical question. How do we decide how complex to make the model? How much constraint is too much?
This is the heart of it all. It's formalized in the bias-variance trade-off. When we think about the total error of a model, we can break it down into three conceptual parts.
Okay.
First, there's the irreducible error. That's just noise in the system measurement error, things you can never get rid of.
The floor for how good your model can ever be. And second is bias squared.
Bias is the error you get from using a model that's just too simple for the job. It's like trying to carve a detailed sculpture with a blunt knife. You miss the details. That's underfitting.
And the third piece is variance.
Variance is the opposite problem. It's the error you get from a model that's too complex, too flexible. It changes wildly based on tiny changes in your training data. It's like using an impossibly sharp knife with a wobbly blade. It captures all the noise and tremors in your hand.
That's overfitting.
That's overfitting, and the whole game is to find that sweet spot. As you increase complexity, you usually decrease bias, but you increase variance.
So we're always looking for that perfect balance.
Yes.
And we can achieve that flexibility using things like splines. I love the concept of the smoothing spline here because it gives us a literal control knob for this trade-off.
It's a beautiful concept. A smoothing spline tries to fit the data, but it adds a penalty that punishes curvature, or wiggleness. And that penalty is controlled by a parameter, lambda.
So if lambda is zero, there's no penalty. The function just wiggles through every single data point.
Total high variance, zero bias. It's just memorizing the data.
And if lambda is infinite?
The penalty is so huge that the only function allowed is a perfectly straight line, maximum bias, minimum variance. So that lambda is your control knob for balancing flexibility and constraint.
So once we have this knob, how do we choose the best setting?
Yeah.
We can't just look at how well it fits the training data, because as you said, the model flatters itself.
You can't. That flattery is what we call optimism. We need robust methods for model assessment and selection to estimate the true error on data it hasn't seen.
There are metrics like AIC or CP that try to estimate this.
They do, and they're useful shortcuts. But the gold standard, the most reliable approach, is cross-validation.
How does that work in practice?
It's pretty simple conceptually. You split your training data into, say, 5 or 10 equal parts or folds. You train your model on all but one of the folds, and then you test its error on that one holdout fold.
And then you just rotate which fold is held out.
You repeat that process until every single piece of data has been in the test set once. Averaging those errors gives you a really stable, unbiased estimate of your true prediction error. It lets you confidently pick the best lambda, the best level of complexity.
It's been quite a journey. We went from a world drowning in data to identifying these huge statistical hurdles like the curse of dimensionality. And the solution, surprisingly, often wasn't more freedom, but more constraint, using things like lasso to manage instability.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you're right. Statistical learning is really about managing two things: the sheer number of features and that unavoidable tension between model stability low variance and flexibility low bias.
When the dimensions get high, rigidity becomes a virtue.
It does, because that local flexibility of something like K and N just becomes a mathematical illusion.
So we saw how that simple k-nearest neighbor rule breaks down when the input dimension gets large, because neighbors aren't really neighbors anymore. But so many modern problems, analyzing images, gene expression, huge text databases, they involve tens of thousands of features.
That's the reality now.
Okay, so here is the final provocative thought for you to explore. What if the true underlying relationship for, say, a medical outcome only exists in a tiny unknown subspace of those thousands of features? How can we use selection methods like lasso not just to predict better, but to actually use those constraints to discover that true sparse signal hidden within that massive ocean of noise?